Hello, 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 and welcome to the full Quota podcast on One World Sports Radio. Remember, this is your cricketing podcast on the One World Sports Radio platform. We've got an EPL podcast, we've got some rugby broadcasts happening. So the most important thing for you to do is to subscribe to our channel, and you will get all these information to you. And also you'll be notified when we go live. Remember, you can also interact with us on these various platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and on YouTube as well. YouTube is the primary broadcast. We're actually currently live on YouTube, Facebook, and as well on Twitter on the One World Sports Radio channels there. Today we've got an interesting guest to talk about how the 100 eventually ended up. It's a new competition. We thought we'd hold off on talking about it until today. We're also going to talk about T20 and go into the World Cup, and then we'll talk about what's going on with the Proteas. So hang on, hold on. There's going to be some drama towards the end. But yeah, let me just get how the guys are doing. Tempo, how are you doing?
Yeah, I am busy. But all right. After yesterday's news, I don't know. I feel strange. I thought we were moving in the right direction, and then
but
we'll hold on. We'll hold that thought.
Looks like we're playing like Arsenal, just pass sideways.
Oh no.
All right, Tim, how are you doing, my man?
I'm doing good. We'll obviously get into the knockback just later on, but all good. Looking forward to this chat we're about to have with Dan.
Yes. So what we have, and as Tim has said, we've got Dan Weston with us today. He is a player recruiter and analyst for Leicestershire County Cricket Club, as well as he's the Birmingham Phoenix. He also worked for the Birmingham Phoenix in a similar capacity in the 100 for both the men's and women's teams. He's got some interesting ideas on T20s for South Africa, so hang around once we get into that, because I think it's going to be quite an interesting conversation. So let's bring Dan on. And let's get him to let us know about his world as a player, analyst, and a recruiter. Hi, Dan. How are you doing?
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. It's been really looking forward to having a chat about this.
No, yes, it is quite awesome. And so just to start off, Dan, just give us I think for me, the interesting part, obviously, you're a player recruiter. So just give the viewers and the listeners a taste of how you got into the game and how you landed up at being a player recruitment specialist or an analyst.
Yeah, sure. So I've always been very much interested in cricket from a young age, of all sports really. I was a massive sports fan from being a young child. Always been pretty good at maths as well, particularly like mental arithmetic, trying to solve problems and things like that using numbers. In England, there's a TV show called Countdown. I don't know if you have it in South Africa, and like they have like maths, 6 random numbers and like a big number, and you have to use the 6 numbers to solve the big number and stuff like that. And I was doing those type of things when I was like 4 years old and stuff. And it's always had that interest. And then after university, I did a degree in accounting, so again, quite maths-orientated background. Worked in the gambling industry for a long time, did stuff like playing professional poker online, things like that, which is worth mentioning because there's a lot of skill set crossovers between pro poker, online poker, and what I do now in cricket. Because, for example, one of the things that poker teaches you primarily is that it's a process-driven environment rather than a results-orientated scenarios. So in poker, you can play amazing, because there's still a luck element. On a given day, you could still lose. On another day, you could play badly and still win. And it goes in the same cricket. You can play well and lose. You can play badly and win. Small margins, fine margins, a lot of high variance in an individual match, and probably in some tournaments as well, especially knockout tournaments like the World Cup, which obviously we're going to go on and speak about later on. So there's a lot of crossover. It helped me also do a lot of statistical analysis, because I use a lot of statistical tools to analyse my own poker game, check out how opponents are playing and stuff like that. And the crossover between that and analysing batters and bowlers and teams and opposition scouting and stuff is actually really, really similar. So you're plenty of crossover. And then about 5 years ago, I sort of like because I developed a lot of those skills, I thought, well, I'll build a cricket database and see where I go from there. And then that was difficult to get out of once I started, because I started realizing that like teams were making more mistakes than I thought, and commentators didn't really have a clue what they were talking about and stuff. And and then I started building more and more databases, and then it turned itself from a hobby eventually into something of a business. So it's very difficult to get roles. As like a non-ex-player, it's very difficult to get a decent job in cricket. So you have to work really hard to try and prove your worth, both in terms of marketing yourself, but also in terms of when you do get jobs. I feel like you have to work twice as hard. It shouldn't be like that, but I feel like you have to work twice as hard to prove yourself, because you're not a known quantity and you're not an ex-player, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's been a difficult journey to get decent jobs, but I'm fortunate now that I've got a couple of good roles, and we'll see what happens from there. Hopefully we'll pick up a couple more, and some other franchise leagues and stuff like that, and hopefully the results of the teams that I work for have gone pretty well this year generally. So obviously we spoke about the 100. Obviously, I'm very disappointed. Obviously, we didn't win the final on Saturday, but we topped the group stage. We outperformed all the teams on a lot of different metrics as well, which was something which coincided with our recruitment plans too. So that was good. So we hit those objectives. At Leicestershire, I think that it's important to rationalise the fact that we have a lower budget compared to pretty much every other county. So even if we've come halfway, that's a pretty decent success. This year so far, we've actually got a higher win percentage this year than any year for the last 10 years. So that I think what I'm trying to say is that these things show that analytics and an unconventional approach, if you like, actually do work.
Yeah, no, we're gonna delve into the whole analytics versus eye test. Temple.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a question along those lines, because obviously for us laymen out here, we just pop onto Crick Info. We're like, look at the strike rates, look at the run rate. Sorry, the average. That's the other one. Sorry, brain's a bit puzzled. But what other stats are there? Like, can you give us like a quick look into the type of stats that you look at? Do you look at like strike rate per 10 balls on this field on this day? Like demystify it for me.
Yeah, I'll leave the random stuff like the fastest Test century scored on a Tuesday to few people on Twitter who seem to really love that sort of stuff. I don't. So basically, there's loads of stuff. I mean, it's difficult even to know where to start. So for example, you talk about average and strike rate. I actually don't really evaluate, in T20 at least, I don't really evaluate average as a particularly useful metric, because strike rate and boundary percentage is far more valuable in terms of determining success for teams. And I actually look at balls per dismissal rather than average. So I look at balls per dismissal and strike rate, or balls per dismissal and boundary percentage to be a little bit more specific. And you can classify players' skill sets by their boundary percentage, so how aggressive they might be, for example, and how much intent. Intent is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and you can gauge a player's intent level pretty accurately by their boundary percentage over a decent sample size. You might want to split those up by, for example, different phases: power play, middle overs, depth. You might want to look at splitting them up further against pace bowlers and spin bowlers, or various spin types. But all this kind of information will enable you to build plans for dealing with an individual opponent in a given match. So we might say, for sake of argument, we've got a right-hander and he's really weak at the ball turning away from him. So we might want to bomb him with like slow left arm or some leg spin or something like that. And that might be a viable plan against a specific opponent. So there's a lot of things that you can really delve into. They're a lot deeper than those sort of basic quick info metrics. And I haven't scratched the surface of some of the advanced metrics that I use for recruitment, which I can't really talk about in a public domain because at the moment, I mean, this year in the Blast in England, I managed to find Leicestershire the top run scorer and the top wicket taker for our overseas players. So I can't give away all the secrets.
Would you be able to give us an idea in what you saw in people like Marcus Harris, Josh Inglis, and particularly for our South African viewers, when you initially signed Vian Mulder? You've told me previously that Vian Mulder, it was quite difficult to get footage of him. So what was it about him that attracted you to initially sign him before you had to replace him?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I can't go into like massive specifics with regards to specific players, but with Vian, I think it's important to realise is that he's far ahead of the curve for players of his age and has been for a long time, which illustrates, he didn't even play like semi-pro cricket in South Africa. He went straight into franchise level. So his stats are real, whereas I think some players, their first class stats, they might have played 80% of their matches in, say, 3 days rather than 4 days, and it's a lower standard, and that inflates their first class numbers. You've got to be kind of very aware of that. So with Vian, his numbers were real. His numbers were very, very good. There's not that many players who bat in the top 6 and can be a frontline bowling option or a very viable bowling option. I think he would go pretty well in English conditions as well. And we thought we were getting 102 players for one, really, if you like. And there's not many players around the world who can do that. So I think that's really important. So that gives you kind of some insight into what I might be thinking about there. So there's a scarcity of resources argument as well as an individual player's quality, and I think that's something that any recruiter really try and think about a little bit, because when you're prioritising recruitment, for example, in England there's like 101 really good T20 batters, but there's not that many good bowlers. So you're shopping in 2 different markets effectively in terms of that scarcity of resources. And so that was some thought process towards Vian. Marcus was someone who had done consistently well in Sheffield Shield. I built a model that showed me that Sheffield Shield was a slightly higher standard than county cricket, and generally players very, very slightly improved their Sheffield Shield numbers in county cricket. And he did a great job for us as well. And Inglis and Nav in T20. So Josh, again, that was very data-driven. Model outputs. He was good at the ball turning away from a right-hander as well as with faces spin, which was kind of like something we were really looking for a player who could do well for that. And Nav is someone that I've been watching for 2+ years as soon as he started playing franchise cricket, and I like what I see from him in terms of like multi-phase flexibilities, the phases that he bowls in. So it is quite good for flexible plans, and he's got a good number of variations, which I think batters find quite hard to pick. And he's a passionate guy, clever guy. I like the fact he gives the batters some send-offs and stuff sometimes, and so he's a guy who's up for the battle, not up for that. So quite a good character, and I like that as well.
Okay, let's just have let's go just into the 100. Obviously, Leicestershire had the T20 Blast, and then afterwards there was the 100. What is your opinion, and what's the general consensus in the country around the 100? Have more people gone to love it, and also are there what learnings can people take into T20 with the 100?
Okay, so you asked about a general consensus, and I think that there isn't one, because unfortunately it has polarised cricket supporters in England. So a general consensus certainly in my view doesn't exist. I wish it did, but I personally would, regardless of whether I worked in the league or not, I think that the high quality franchise league needed to come to England, be it a new format or there's not really a new format, it's a slightly different format, or whether it was T20, it didn't really bother me in that respect. But I was strong on the fact that we needed a real high quality domestic tournament, because as good as the T20 Blast is, it's 18 teams, so there's that clear dilution of quality between teams, because you can't have 18 teams full of really good players, but you can have 8 teams full of really good players. And there's a clear point I made on Twitter the other day, is the fact that in the Blast, it's probably pretty similar to South African domestic cricket in my view. I think very similar dynamics in that there's usually at least two players in every team who are like, maybe they're not great hitters, they nerdle it around a little bit, they don't really have like big hitting in their locker. And it's the same in the Blast. And then also in the Blast, there's like 1 or 2 opposition bowlers, you can probably target and get away with targeting. Whereas a lot of the time in the 100, I felt that there was no real let up in terms of opposition bowler quality. They just kept on coming after you. And the same with batters, they were kept on coming after the bowlers. There was no consolidation. There was no players who they didn't have the big shots in their locker. Everyone had that intent, and I felt that was indicative of a higher standard of competition. And also there was more overseas players, and there was a big discussion about the quality of the overseas players. But to be honest with you, I thought the quality of overseas players was actually pretty high. What I felt was people got confused a little bit about was the fact that they confused quality with reputation. Because like, people will say, "Oh, I don't know, Josh Inglis came in, or Adam Milne came in, and they're not big names." Well, actually, they're better than most of the big names. So, and they're far better than most of the big names. So, like, what do you want? Do you want guys who are like declining and with a massive reputation but really not that great anymore, or do you want guys who are actually really good? And I would, as a recruiter, of course, I want guys who are really, really good. I don't care about reputation. Reputation doesn't bother me in the slightest. So I think that there was a lot of agenda against the 100 to start with, from a lot of kind of traditionalist and county supporters and stuff like that. As the tournament progressed, particularly after the wildcard draft, and as the tournament progressed in terms of the matches, I felt that the number of people who were against it dwindled quite a lot. So there was a lot of people who were like, okay, well, I've grown to accept it. And in some cases, I think also grown to enjoy it, which is great. And yeah, from my perspective, it was a fantastic experience, but also the fact that I saw so many, all the grounds were packed. I saw so many people enjoying themselves and having a great time. After every game we played, I used to do like a Twitter search of Birmingham Phoenix, because I wanted to see what people wrote about our team. And the amount of people who you do a Twitter search and it will come up with like, a parent with a photo of them and their children saying, "We've had the best day out at watching Birmingham Phoenix," and they've all got Birmingham Phoenix kit and stuff like that. And I just think that's absolutely amazing that we can help contribute that to a family and hopefully children who are going to grow up enjoying cricket and loving the game and wanting to emulate guys like Mo, Liam Livingstone, Adam Milne, people like that, guys who are their role models basically in terms of what they've achieved in cricket and their level of performances and stuff. And I just think that's fantastic. And whether people agree or disagree with me, that's absolutely fine. But you don't see a lot of families at 4-day matches in England. You don't see a lot of people at 4-day matches full stop. But families and stuff and kids having a great time, you just don't see it very often. But this was, I think, a really good vehicle to get a lot of new fans into the sport, and that can only be good for the sport in general moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds so exciting. Like, I won't lie, when you spoke about family, it played on the heartstrings.
Yeah,
it's all about family. That's pretty
cool. Okay. I love
speaking. Oh, sorry, I'll go.
Yeah, no, I loved seeing that. I agree with you completely. Yeah.
So you're speaking about initially when you came into like your role as the main stats guy, the stats guru, that you noticed a lot of teams making a lot of mistakes, and teams like RCB come to mind where, as you mentioned, it's all about reputation. You got like the big names there, but in terms of quality, they leave a lot to be desired. They're not getting trophies. So what are the types of like mistakes that teams usually make with recruiting, adding to like reputation over quality,
It's interesting you raised the RCB example. I actually think they're doing a little bit better now than they have done for years. So they seem to have been working pretty well with their recruitment strategies of late. So I endorse a lot more of their strategies this year than perhaps they might have done before. I think a lot of mistakes we'll make. Okay, so one, they don't understand the difference in standard and the different dynamics from one league to another. So I'll give you an example. So it's pretty well known the IPL teams love Australian players, and I think that at some stage that faith was fairly justified, but not quite fully justified. But in the last few years, I don't see the Big Bash being as a higher standard as it used to be, and the IPL teams still value the players the same, even though the standard has dropped. And it's a lot easier to bowl in a Big Bash against not the best caliber of batter and on big boundaries. And then when you go and play at the IPL, you know, small boundaries and amazing batters, and it's not a surprise to see Australian bowlers struggle on a general basis in the IPL from that perspective. There's a lot of stuff like recency bias that we spoke about Big Bash. Oftentimes, the IPL auction will coincide with the Big Bash at some point. So, like, maybe the first half of the Big Bash, a few players have done well, get picked up by IPL teams because they're like in the current eye, if that makes sense. They're on TV doing well and stuff. There's that recency bias. A few times that's happened with West Indies as well. They've had a conveniently organised T20 series against India about a week before the IPL auction. So a few of the West Indies players did well against India. Yeah, indeed. Are picked up for big money. I think that coaches, sometimes they recruit known quantities too much to them. So, like, for example, they want to pick players that they know, maybe some of their friends, things like that. Owners get involved, which tends to lead to emotional, non-logical decision-making. There's also other things that influence poor recruitment, stuff like not understanding of role clarity. So, for example, buying a bowler who bowls in the middle overs and then expecting him to bowl at the death and be a superstar, which just doesn't happen. There's plenty of stuff. So many mistakes that teams make. I'm trying to think. They don't value the right metrics a lot of times. So a lot of teams prioritise dot ball avoidance over boundary hitting, when boundary hitting is proven to be a more winnable strategy. If that makes sense.
Sorry, say that again.
Boundary hitting versus dot ball avoidance. So, for example, some players are like very risk averse, so they don't like hitting boundaries because they don't want to get out, but they will try and like rotate the strike and avoid dot ball. So I call it dot ball avoidance. Whereas other players, they don't care if they dot up because the amount of boundaries they hit massively outweighs the dots. The decreasing value from the dots. You know, someone like Chris Gale would be a historical example of that. Someone who, you know, he has a high percentage of dots, but he also has a high percentage of boundaries, and historically that's been a strategy that worked for him. So dot ball avoidance doesn't tend to win you as many matches as boundary hitting does. So it's a poor strategy to sign dot ball avoiders on a general basis, but teams still love them.
Okay, that says a lot about the way we speak about cricket. I was spoke about T20s in that West Indies series.
Avoidance.
This is why I wanted Dad on the show, Paul. I wanted him to debunk that theory about dot balls. What I wanted to just ask is, with the 100, did your approach in terms of recruitment change with the slight changes that they have? So having 5 ball overs, having the bowler allowed to bowl 10 balls straight, did that change your approach at all in terms of who you picked?
A little bit, yes and no. No, because no one really knew what the impact of 10 ball overs was going to be in advance, because it was a new concept that no one had ever seen before. I think we all had ideas about how it might play out, and I actually think that my ideas were pretty accurate in advance, but there was certainly some other areas where I think it was a learning curve for a lot of teams, and I think some teams made some mistakes with that as well. So we didn't know how that was going to play. So we couldn't really factor in decision making that much with the double overs and stuff like that. With regards to the difference in format, I think the biggest difference is the fact that you've got 20 balls less and a lower percentage of power play balls as well. So that's those factors are important to bear in mind. So if you've got 20 less balls, but you've got the same amount of wickets, you should, in theory, value wicket preservation slightly less than you would in T20. And therefore, you should look to dial up the aggression a little bit with your batting.
Okay. That's an interesting one. So if you look at the other T20 tournaments around the world, well, especially ours, what are your thoughts around that? Because I've always thought that, well, actually, let's not talk T20 tournaments. Let's talk about actually international teams because we're going to a World Cup. The style of cricket teams play. Like, where do you think certain countries are in terms of the way they play? I know South Africa, I think we were talking dot ball avoidance and things like that. And we're always thinking that England always at the front of the curve. But yeah, so if you're looking at the style of play and the way in which teams are playing T20, what countries are on the cusp and what countries do need work, and what are the different styles?
So I think that there's two different styles, and both of them are fine, but you have to understand the strengths and weaknesses of both. But then there's a lot of teams who sort of fall between the two and don't really have that clear strategy or identity or brand of cricket that they play. I think maybe you could even put South Africa in that. I would probably put actually a couple of others, Pakistan possibly as well would be in that bracket where they've not really got an identity at the moment. So you've got one extreme, which will be England. They're just going to try and hit you out of the match with load of batters, decent batting depth, and hitters, plus Malan.
Malan's not a hitter. Every time I watch him, he's not a hitter. The ball out the park.
But
he just hits us, bro.
But the flip side is that I don't value some of their bowlers particularly highly. So they could easily be hamstrung by those issues with their bowling group. So because they're going to concede a higher percentage of boundaries, I think, than other teams or some other teams, they will need to hit more to win those matches as well. So it's like a double-edged conundrum, if you like. On the reverse side, then you've got teams with the really strong bowling attacks who maybe they don't have those hitters so much. So, if you're looking at franchise cricket, it's a model that Sunrisers Hyderabad had for a while. Perth Scorchers had it when Justin Langham was there. Sussex have done it pretty well in England as well over the years. Is that they've got such a good bowling group, they just try and restrict teams to like 150 odd, chase it down pretty easily, just knocking it around. Or even if they hit like a 140, 150, 155 kind of score back at first, they'll back themselves to defend it with their quality bowling attack as well. So you've got like strong batting lineups on one side, strong bowling lineups on the other side, and then West Indies are probably pretty similar to England in being very batter heavy. And then you've got a few other teams sort of on that scale in between, if that makes sense. With regards to South Africa, I don't see them as one of the favourites for the World Cup. I see probably England and India as the favourites, but because it's a bit like the 100. You wouldn't really want to put like a huge amount of confidence into you think which team is going to be like, who's going to win, or you wouldn't want to be such absolute because most teams have got some pretty good players. You take one or two players on that team as a day out, they can still win the match. And in a knockout tournament, it's high volatility, high variance, and that's important to understand as well. And even if you're like, say, 40-60 underdog in two knockout matches, you're still going to win the tournament 16% of the time. So the best team doesn't always win a tournament. I'm pretty strong on that, but a lot of teams will have a chance, but they're going to need their star players to have a day out.
Okay.
All right. Where do you think South Africa need to improve in terms of this format? And while there are other good T20 competitions around the world, what do you think South Africa need to do to make theirs a more competitive one?
Yeah,
And
okay.
yeah.
I'll go with the national team first. So I think there's a few skill set deficiencies which the national team have right now. First is a general lack of very aggressive batters, guys who average over 20% boundaries. So, for example, if they face 100 balls, they hit over 20 of those balls to boundaries. Very, very few players in the domestic pool or in the international team have that dynamic. And if they do, they usually have a really low balls per dismissal. So they're just like a kind of slogger basically and get out pretty quick. Whereas England have got like guys who have like 20 plus boundary percentage and 20 plus balls per dismissal, and they're nowhere near the national team. But you know, if they were playing for South Africa, they'd be superstars, like in the national team, no doubt about that. Someone like Go Clark would be a really good example of that, I think. So there's a lack of hitting quality or lack of hitting depth in the local player pool. I also think that you can get at the South African team by bowling a lot of spin. Their batters don't tend to strike that well against spin compared to other teams. And it's interesting because I think you played in West Indies fairly recently in a T20 series, and they didn't exploit that at all. So I'm not sure who was running their opposition scouting for West Indies. They didn't. I think in one game, Chris Gale was their only spin bowler used, which kind of tells you a lot about like their lack of exploiting South Africa in that series in terms of that spin weakness. I also think that you lack a real high quality right arm leg spinner, and there is a guy who can do it. And I spent the last month with him. Yeah. So just to clarify for your listeners, that's Imran Tahir, who's 42 years old, but still an incredible bowler and an even better guy. He's a fantastic man. I really enjoyed spending the last month with him. I personally, if I was involved with the South African national team, I would definitely have him in the squad as well. And probably the last area, I think you lack a hitting all rounder, a real aggressive hitting all rounder. You know, like a trying to think of some names, like an Andre Russell type player or a Hardik Pandya type player, or
Chris Morris.
Yeah, but he doesn't
work.
It would work, but he doesn't really seem like in complete favour in the national team a lot of the time.
Oh yes, we know that. We're just naming him because
yeah.
He's on the outs.
Yeah.
We've got Pretorius, but he wasn't available for the West Indies series.
Yeah,
but his strike rate is over 150.
Yeah, but at the death, you need a lot more than 150.
Yeah, 170, 80.
170 plus, yeah.
Sheesh.
What are the progressions? What are the progressions that you would see in batsmen in the different phases of the thing with a strike rate or even with a boundary percentage?
So broadly speaking, of strike rates, and boundary percentage, for recruitment purposes, I wouldn't even look at someone who's got a boundary percentage below 16%. So I would just draw a line straight through them.
Okay. But then in the back end, for instance, if you're looking for a number 6 hitter, must that be like a 25?
20 plus easy, yeah.
And then in the power play, must that be also 20?
Yeah, I mean, guys who strike well in the power play tend to do it about 140 plus. There's a few like guys like Will Jackson, England, who just absolutely tees off and smashes it. Adam Lyth is another domestic player who doesn't get national team recognition. He plays a similar role. He hasn't had the best year this year, but he's got long-term pretty good data in that area. Then there's plenty of other examples as well. So there's guys in England who don't even get close to the national team who can strike at like 140 plus in the power play, like no dramas at all. They'll even strike like well over 120 for their first 10 balls that they face and stuff like that. Like they don't start slow at all.
Okay, and then so this idea, because obviously some teams like Pakistan and South Africa, which are similar, will have a guy like Baba Azam and maybe even a Timber Boom at the top, who don't have the high boundary percentages, but they are big on dot ball avoidance.
Yes.
Has that role kind of diminished with where England and India have taken the T20 game?
Yeah, I think it has. Now, I'm pretty strong on this. So I don't really value what many people call an anchor batter. Okay, so let me try and explain this with pretty articulately. So you can only have an anchor batter if your bowling lineup is really good. Okay, because you're trading off boundary hitting by having an anchor in your team. So then you have to have the positive trade-off of boundary prevention.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So
Yeah.
if you have a guy who's not a good hitter, you have to have really good boundary preventers. And that's why I'm not convinced about Dawid Malan in the England team, because he's not a good hitter, in my view. He's an anchor kind of player, but he can hit because his death strike rate is incredible. So actually, he does have the upside, but I think he just chooses not to use it until later on in his innings. But because England don't have the best bowling group, they putting Milan into their team because they need a team with 7 or 8 hitters in it, because their bowling group is in my opinion below average. But then if you had Milan in Australia with like Cummins and Stark and all these world-class bowlers, then he probably would work pretty well, because you've got bowlers who can keep the opposition boundary percentage down. So you want a fairly stable batting lineup because you're chasing lower scores generally. But it's hard to, it sounds weird, but you're kind of looking to your batting group is almost determined by your bowling group, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. So essentially, you have to look at your bowlers and see how many boundaries and how many runs they can preserve or protect.
Yes.
And then you figure out how you can actually get the maximum amount of runs you think your bowling group can get in an average game. Yeah,
precisely. And that's, so you have to be aware of your bowling group's faults when you're picking a batting group, or your strengths and weaknesses. But there's certain players who I think are anchors, and some people call anchors who I don't think are anchors. So it's like I call some players like a facilitator. So a facilitator would be someone who, by their presence in the team, enables everyone else to maximise their boundary percentage. And it's a fine line between being an anchor and a facilitator. But a facilitator would generally have better hitting upside, and they're better at pacing their innings, and they can pace their innings accordingly to the match situation a lot better than a traditional anchor who will just bat slowly no matter what. So there's a slight subtle definition between anchor and a facilitator, and in terms of those guys who maybe strike at around or below average strike rates.
And that's just around strike rotation, giving the hitter on the other end as many balls as possible while you get yourself into the game.
Yeah, or just because you're looking to bat through and you're giving them the strike. Where the anchors fall down is that they look to bat through, but they don't give the other players the strike a lot. So they end up playing they're chewing up a lot of balls, but they're not accelerating the scoreboard. So if you look at it like this, right? If you have a guy who gets 30 off 30 and gets out, and you think par's 170, right? Your other batters need to score 140 off 90 to get 170 in T20.
Which is basically where we are as a national side. That's basically where we are at the moment.
So you can't break 170.
If you have one guy who scores 30 off 30, the rest of your team need to strike at like 155 or something to hit 170 as a total. So you can see the impact of those low strike rate innings on teams and their totals overall.
I hadn't seen it like that. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's crazy. Are there any like statistical anomalies? Like you look at the stats, you're like, this guy he's not as good as people think, but then they keep playing games. Not like saying that's like they're trash or anything, but somehow they still have match-winning innings, even though the stats are speaking a different language or telling a different story.
Yeah, they're definitely every player can have a day out on its day, but the chances of them having a day out are low. So I won't say the player who it is, but at Leicester this year, I said that one of the opposition players wasn't a key wicket, and they ended up hitting about 60 or 35 balls against us. So like, he still had a day out against us and made me look a bit of an idiot. But what you have to understand is that he might have had like a 3% chance of playing that innings, whereas like De Villiers might have had a 50% chance of playing that innings. But because the 3% chance is still a real chance, you know, that's, if that makes sense. So it can happen on his day. His days just happen less often.
Makes sense.
I think it's important not to look in like absolute terms, like one way or the other. You have to look at like the likelihood of an event happening rather than the being ruled by the actual outcome.
Thanks.
I've just got one final question from my end. Is there a South African player that you have seen that the national side could use with this World Cup and another one next year? Is there somebody that the selectors are not picking that you that you've
mentioned one already?
Oh, outside of Tahir, preferably a batsman.
Because we're looking for that.
You're asking a possible question there. I don't really. To be honest with you, I don't think so hugely. But my dogs come to say hello.
Hi, doggo.
Yeah. but also, there's not enough coverage of the South African domestic cricket in England for me to really go and say this guy he should be playing. There's not much on the TV at all.
Okay. So obviously you said you started this database of stats when you were going about. If somebody wanted to like start their own database for the South African guys, how does it start? Do you just go to Cricket? Is there like a database? Or do you just literally sit there like a scorer?
I try to refine freely available databases.
Okay.
That's what I started, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Dan, thank you very much for joining us. You've given us and our listeners and our viewers a lot to think about regarding this T20 team and how to see the shorter format of the game. Really, really do appreciate you spending your time with us. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been really great. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the cricket this evening.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure. Awesome.
Cheers,
Thank you. That's Dan Weston, guys. Let's just give ourselves a little bit of a break and we'll come back and discuss it on the other side of this.
Hi everyone, I'm Denisha Devnarayan and you're watching the Full Quota podcast on One World Sports Radio.